Welcome back. Tonight we're going to look at the First World War, and we'll be talking about the introduction to that war, the war to end all wars, the Great War, and unfortunately it wasn't so great. It didn't end all war, and it pretty well set up the Second World War, or what some have theorized is really a 20th century of war, about 100 years of close to non-stop fighting through World War I, World War II, and then something called the Third World War. And I know some people were like, well, I didn't think we had a World War III. We didn't have a World War III, but there is a way of thinking about it in that the two major powers after World War II, USSR and the United States, fight through proxies in the global south, in the southern part of the globe, places like Vietnam and Korea that are most notable and what Americans seem to remember, but also places throughout Central South America and Africa, and this is potentially setting up 100 years of war. So, I hate to think about it this way, but if you could go back in time and change something or tweak an event or something that happened to set up World War I, where would you go with that and what would you do? So it's something to keep in mind as we flip through this and look at it. So first, on the first slide here, you'll see what seems to be trenches. They very well could be, but these trenches are probably in better condition than some of the ones along the Western Front. Maybe this is more towards the Ottoman Empire. And on the right side here, this is Frank Buckles, born February 1st, 1901, and died February 27th, 2011. I always think it's interesting that date, February 27th, because right around the date that we'll record this video on today, Monday, February 24th. So it's coming up on the day that Frank Buckles had passed away. This is starting, the first chapter starting off, part 6, in Strayer's Ways of the World. It's the most recent century. I want to spend also a moment to think of this. Is it possible that this last 100 years, it's really 1914 to 2014, is it possible that these 100 years, it's maybe impossible, it may be very difficult to even know what happened? Can you look back over just that short period of time and classify that as an era or unit or period of time for history? Some people think maybe it's been too soon. We're not quite sure what's happening yet, and can we come to grips with it or be able to classify it? Some think it's probably too early. Frank Buckles is the last surviving American to have fought in World War I. So as you can see here, he has passed away 2011 at age 110 years and 26 days. That's a pretty long, full life. Now, he did fight in World War I, but he was over there as an ambulance driver. He kind of lied his way in, which many young men did. He was only 16 at the time. So he drove ambulances, and then when he returned from war, he kind of bounced around some and was still in the military. He found himself in the Philippines, I believe it was, during World War II when the Japanese attacked, and he became a prisoner of war for the Japanese. This is during World War II, and goodness, he was a prisoner for 39 months in near starving conditions, and then was liberated in 1945, then right at the end of the war. So Frank Buckles is definitely an American hero in a number of different ways, and he and a photographer who shot the image at the top right side, and I believe the one down here at the bottom left, David Jejong, was a person who was going around and shooting portrait images and capturing, like we see at the top right-hand side in the slide here, of the oldest and surviving members of World War I all across the world. Unfortunately, they are slowly but surely leaving us. So this is a little video clip here off the website. If you go out and search for it, I think the link might be broken, but on this link here, but it's Pershing's Last Patriot is the name of it. We'll find out who Pershing is later on. He'll be the American leading troops into battle. So the image here, we'll look at the path to war. It's a muddy, kind of hellish landscape. And you can see the soldier here has his hands over his eyes. He is caked in mud. And it's hard to even make out that there is a buggy back here that's been overturned and destroyed. And that's the body of a horse as it lies here, I'm sure. He is dead. This is a very bloody, muddy, in this case, atrocious war. So what are the steps that we see that led us to war? And many teachers use this. I'm going to use sort of an acronym here to help remember it. Militarism, or as I used to call it, industrialized militarism, is a big part of it. The Vickers machine gun that you see there, 1912 is when that thing gets going. Of course, the war starts in 1914. But you have, as we've looked at in the last couple chapters here, colonialism and imperialism, this race for the resources and the ability to get what you need from these colonies to then design and have an industrial base. Some countries in Europe don't seem to have that and want it desperately, and others are building it up so strong that it puts pressure on the other countries to also build up their military forces. Alliances is the A in our acronym, and alliances are a serious problem. Now, they're meant to be defensive, that you're going to have a friend in a neighboring country, and in that way, why would they attack you? Because if you would attack, well, you're really attacking 2 or 3 countries instead of just one, so it would hopefully minimize war and prevent it. That's not what happened. You see in the picture here, you've got Serbia as the little guy at the bottom, and he says, "If you touch me, ow," which I don't know what Serbia's going to do. Serbia had already been kind of touched or taken over by Austria. And as we'll find out, a dispute between these two in an event leads to the skirmish where Austria-Hungary, not just Austria, but the Empire of Austria-Hungary, invades Serbia and goes to battle with them. I already had them invaded, but they go to war to destroy the people working against Austria and the Austrian-Hungarian government, because they want to be separate, to have a Yugoslav country created. Now, right behind Austria is Russia, who's not friends with Austria in any way, really, but they're a big brother to Serbia. And the Russian leader says, if you hit that little feller, ow, and so there's Serbia's friend. Well, backing up Austria behind Russia is Germany, and saying, if you strike my little friend, or my friend, ow, and Germany and Austria, those 2 countries right there in the center of Europe, Germany above Austria-Hungary, they are friends in a way, and very similar territory, and in some ways similar leadership anyway, their monarchs. And of course in the back you see France and Great Britain, not quite so sure, but they're coming to the rescue if needed. So these alliances broke down in this whole path to war. That was part of the issue. Imperialism, as I mentioned before, industrialized militarism, alliances, and then imperialism comes into play as well. It's kind of similar to what I'd mentioned. But on the right, you see Germany and Austria-Hungary in this tug of war. You can always spot Germany because they got the spiky helmet. Austria-Hungary, they've got the funky mustache. And here, this could be really anybody, but that's Austria-Hungary. This is Germany. And they're doing the tug of war here. They're 2 pretty big guys. But on the other side here, you've got Great Britain and France and Russia, which is right here. And all of these countries, many of them, have colonies, imperial powers. They are imperial powers or they're colonies. And Germany, and to an extent Russia as well, but Germany and Austria-Hungary want what the countries in Western Europe seem to have. They have easy access and ports out to the ocean, and they have an easy transportation system. Great Britain's the biggest empire in the world's history at this point. Germany is quite jealous of what Great Britain has and the United Kingdom then. Nationalism is the last of our main reasons for war. Nationalism's red for a reason. The passionate color red to symbolize that you are going to follow those who are leading you into war and feel very strongly about what they're asking you to do, and you'll do that blindly and without question. That's why here these number of people are marching and saluting, and also are wearing a blindfold because they're not really looking for themselves. They're just doing what everybody else is doing. Patriotism can be a powerful thing. It's similar to nationalism, but it also can be a destructive thing. And as we talked about in class, in a few of the classes today, it's one thing to be a patriot or to feel very strongly about your country, but written into the United States founding documents, the Declaration of Independence says that if your government is not quite doing the job it should do, then your job as citizens is to revolt against that and bring about change to have a more righteous government. So there are your four: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And following the same theme here about the color scheme, well, militarism is sort of that dark red color or maroon color. And maybe if you're an Aggie fan, you get that with the core. But the alliances are blue in that they were defensive. They were meant to cool things off, a blue color. Imperialism is green for the land that they wanted to accumulate, the green grass of land. And then, of course, as I said, nationalism being red. So 9+ million people were killed. The casualty rate exacerbated by the belligerents' technological and industrial sophistication and stupidity in many ways. They had these new toys to work with, and I'm not quite sure how to use them properly. And they're made worse by that tactical stalemate, especially on the Western Front, where they have the trench warfare. It seems to settle in there for 4 years of completely disastrous battle. So it's the fifth deadliest conflict in the history of the world, and it paves the way for major political changes. And in Europe, of course, those political changes lead to a totalitarian government and dictatorships in Germany, fascist governments in Italy, and really World War I paves the way for a communism power, Russia, to become the USSR, but also to be run solely by singular leaders, Lenin and then Stalin, who were probably some of the worst leaders in the history of the world because of the way that they were so difficult to so many members of their population. They ran it with an iron hand and iron fist, that's for sure. But it also sparked revolutions later on down the road, especially in areas of the global south. And we'll talk about South Africa and India being two of those. Now, they're not initially sparked by World War I. In fact, the colonial folks who come over, the subjects, if you will, of Great Britain who come to Europe to fight, are certainly not doing so to win their freedom. Although sometimes they're sort of said, tongue-in-cheek, wink-wink, that might happen. It doesn't happen. But it lays the groundwork, as we'll learn in later chapters in 23 and 24, that these countries could rise up and break the bonds of their imperial oppressors. So let's look at nationalism and alliances a little closer here. The map at the top right is a pretty instructive one. It's pretty simple. Great Britain and France and Russia, sort of the bread of the sandwich here. And I always like to think of it this way. Maybe some German bratwurst and Austria-Hungarian sausages and Italian meats and cheeses. That's the inner part of the initial sandwich here. And we get some blood spilled in Serbia. Maybe that's a ketchup, I don't know, or the hot sauce. But you see the dominoes that fall, and those are pretty interesting too. And that's sort of what happens here. You've got alliance systems, nationalism and alliance systems that kind of work together to not have a defensive posturing happening in Europe, and with militarism as well. What you're seeing is a situation where if you go to war, it's going to create war with other nations. They're all going to be at war before they know it. So the first of these alliances is the Triple Alliance. In 1882, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Although Italy is kind of interesting because they're playing both sides. It's a bit of a double game here. They are making arrangements with the Triple Entente as well, because they want to make sure that they're going to stay in the right side of things. And Italy's not a very strong, powerful country just yet. In fact, it's one of the last countries to kind of form up here. Everybody thinks Italy was a country just right after the fall of Rome, and that's not how things worked out. But Italy entered into agreements as defensive alignment with Austria-Hungary and Germany, and they never really wanted it to be a situation where they were going to go to war. So in the end, when the war does start, they remain neutral until later on, and then they join the Triple Entente. So it's really Germany and Austria-Hungary, and I should probably kind of bold those two and maybe lighten Italy on the slide. That might help you remember it some. But I do want you to see these first three. And for me, and for on the test, I want you to understand these first three, which lead to war, and to remember them by their names. The Triple Alliance of 1882, they become the Central Powers. And the Triple Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia, who later become the Allies. These three kind of stick together here, France, Great Britain, and Russia, although, as you'll see, Russia is not quite industrialized enough, deals with a revolution of their own, and it's not long before it's really France and Great Britain against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, why does Great Britain get involved in the war? They're the greatest power on the face of the earth that they really need at this time to jeopardize their empire or put their resources into world war. The decision was a tough one for the British people, but their defensive folks and their leadership said, we can't afford to have a German continent. And they felt like Germany was becoming so strong that they were going to overwhelm France, certainly, and could overwhelm Russia if they struck them before industrialization hit Russia. And they feared losing the continent of Europe, not the British Isles, but the continent of Europe, to a German power. Ironically, some have theorized, and Ferguson is one of them, that if they would have just allowed Germany to win a continental war, that World War I would not have happened, and they could have maybe kept Germany, which wanted to expand and be more of an imperialist power, maybe kept them from after World War I, we get World War II, is what I'm basically saying. Maybe agreeing to fight World War I was a big, huge mistake. And Ferguson says that it was. It's an interesting argument. So, the alliance that links Russia, France, and the United Kingdom after the signing of the Anglo-Russian Entente. And Entente means friendship, understanding, or agreement. These three powers, supplemented with Portugal and Japan, are also on the Triple Entente. In that alliance group, they become the Allies, or sometimes they become a counterbalance to the Triple Alliance. And this gets confusing because you got Central Powers and Allies. That's what they're later called. And they're also there's a Triple Alliance and Triple Entente. But in the Second World War, they go through a different phase of alliances or groups that fight against each other. So we'll worry about that another day, but you get the point. This union between France and Great Britain is a very interesting one. Because if you remember back, it wasn't so long ago that we were discussing the hatred that Great Britain had for France, especially during the time of revolution in France, and how much they looked down upon the revolution. They said that France and the Parisians were eating their own in some way. They kind of probably were. And the British thought, as they looked kind of down their nose at the French, that they were uncivilized. But the French and the British seem to feel like a kindred brotherhood. They're more connected than, say, the German-British connection, which, a lot of my students are like, aren't they all just white people? In a way, yeah. But they didn't look at it this way. And as Ferguson argues in the War of the World, he argues that it's really a racial war, racial undertones, and a reasoning for going to war. And you can kind of see that with minority groups. But do you count Great Britain and Germany, or the Anglo-Saxons and Saxons as being different races? He argues that they thought of themselves that way, and that the Anglo-Saxons of Great Britain wanted to be sure that the German Saxons did not take over the continent. Regardless, the colonial powers reached their peak after World War I. And the British and the French control all of this territory when it is over. And it's interesting to kind of note that and look at it here from this point of view. Now at the bottom we've got Marianne and Britannia, the two girls sort of dancing there together, and the two flags intertwined in Vive l'Entente, United We Stand. So in a way they're protecting their colonial interests by joining together. Of course, there is another country that's going to hate this idea, and of course that is Germany. So this is the L'Entente Cordiale, 1915 German view of this Entente Cordiale, which they called Entente Cordiale, which meant agreement, diplomatic or friendship agreement in 1904 between France and Great Britain. And it adjusted colonial disputes that the two countries had, and it sort of like created a pact of friendship. It paves the way for the Anglo-French cooperation against the German expansion, which that's what's going on here. Imperialism is a big part of this. And so in the political cartoon, you see the eagle sort of on the cliff. I don't really get it because I don't know where the cliff is so over top the map, but you get the idea. He's looking across Europe, and he is seeing the spider, the British spider, with flags on those, including a flag of France, as looking across here and taking territory like Turkey and Calais and Italy. So it's streaming across the continent and taking these places. And the eagle does not seem too pleased by this. It's got the crown, the German crown. Why is Germany so jealous of Britain? Because it wants what Britain has. It's the largest empire in the history of the world. Also, you can see it better down here at the bottom. That's Uncle Sam kind of tied up in the web of the British, which is an interesting perspective. Here's another really good one, and I'll tell you who these three are, and then we'll talk through them. This is, of course, looks very much like the Kaiser from Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II. This is a man whose name is John Bull. He's kind of like Uncle Sam, okay? And this woman is, of course, we've talked about her before, Marianne, and she's wearing a dress. This part's red, white, and blue. So, German cartoon, again, this is a German perspective, apparently expressing the rather sour German point of view on this friendship between France and Great Britain. And John Bull walks off with the trollop of France and her scandalously short tricolor skirt with the red, white, and blue colors, and Germany pretends not to care, but obviously it cares. So there's Marianne and Britannia again, this Franco-British expedition, and they're really partners who are going to start looking out for each other, which is bizarre because, the French invested everything they had, Louis did, in the American War for independence against the British just to defeat the British. And in some ways provokes and brings on the French Revolution because of it, because of the terrible state of their economy. However, new times and desperate times call for desperate measures. These guys are definitely going to start working together because of the need to do so. Here's another way of looking at it. It's the L'Entente Cordiale une partie de football. So the French and the British are playing a little bit of football here. It looks like a real football, but I think it's soccer ball, whatever. The British footy. And what's the football? Who are they kicking? Well, he's got a mustache and he's got a pointy hat on, so I think it's Germany. At least this is the view of what's going on. Here's another look at, this is called L'Engordo Trump d'Or. And this is the Germans kind of eating the world. In some ways, that's what the Germans want to do. They want these imperial powers to be able to do that and to have these things. We've watched this. Typically, we watch this in class at the beginning. This is Crash Course, Archdukes, Cynicism, and World War I. It's a really good episode. It would really help you much with this. In class, we've watched Neil Ferguson's very interesting ideas about the War of the World. The 20th century conflict, he says the 100 years of the 20th century, and it results in the descent of the West. And so think about that thesis that we've talked about. In a way, he's very skilled at counterfactual history, which means he's going to look back into the past and say, well, what if this happened? Or, another way of looking at it, he says at the very beginning that he learned as a schoolboy, as I did, that the good guys won the world wars. And that's why they're so powerful today. He thinks that that's not necessarily the case. That this is the rise of and a return to power of the East, not the West. And that the world wars really destroy Western culture, which is Europe and even into the Americas. And it does so in some disastrous ways, according to him. I mean, I don't know. Some people think that by 2017, China will overtake America and become a economically stronger country. But not many people that I know are willing to move to China right now and breathe the air and so forth and so on. I mean, maybe it's going to be more powerful economically, but I don't know if it's a greater country. This is a counterfactual point of view. And do you agree that it's actually correct? And we come back to the point, are we still really unsure of what these wars meant and what their impact were? It's only been about 100 years later. Well, exactly 100 years in 2014. Ferguson believes that much of the conflicts involved here are sparked by racial hatred and exploited by empires, not just nation states, not just Germany and Austria-Hungary, but empires that encompass much of the Earth's population. And to Ferguson, the real story is not the rise of the West, but the emergence of the East. It's a good documentary. I think there's 5 or 6 parts to it. This is the first part. We typically see about half of this in class, and then he gets into more Russian Revolution type stuff towards the end, or towards the middle end. At the very end, he talks Armenian genocide and the slaughter and massacre of the Greeks in Turkey. So there's more evidence that he's showing you to back his thesis, which is that this is more than anything a racial war. And he discusses that also with the Saxons and Anglo-Saxons, the idea that they are going to fight against each other because they view each other as different or others, even other races. Is that the answer here? Who knows? But World War I has a massive impact, and this has just been the quick introduction to it. The next time we'll get going into what causes the war to happen on the ground, not just the alliances and militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism to make it easier. But not only that, we'll look at the events that start the war, the assassination, and then also the games nations play, why Russia decides to attack, and why Germany and Austria-Hungary do what they do, and how France and Great Britain counter off of that. These have great consequences for the world's history, and especially for the next part of the world that we'll be studying here in unit number 6 and part 6 of the year. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time, and don't forget to be awesome.